Hey everybody, welcome back. We have another Photoshop tutorial for you this week. So let's talk about this tutorial. I may have been a little misleading last week when I said it was going to be the most complicated tutorial. We actually got half of the tutorial from last week's when we did the photo adjustment. So all of those adjustment layers are usually a part of this tutorial, and now that we kind of know how those things work, we can just apply those to something a little bit different. So a 5-part composite. The idea here is that we're going to take 5 separate images and then combine them in a seamless way, so that the average viewer wouldn't be able to tell that we've photoshopped this stuff. So we're going to use the same things that we learned from last week, all of those adjustment layers, to manipulate the color and the luminance of these different elements to make them look like they're all part of the same image. There is a couple of extra things that we're going to pick up with this tutorial, but they are fairly minor, and you might even be able to get through this without listening to me for too terribly long. But I will give you some pointers that will help you out. So I'm going to start by finding a background image. For me, I'm just going to use this background of the Sahara Desert. I feel like that works pretty well. And I'm going to look at this for a second too, because things like shadows and highlights are really important. Everything that I add to this photo needs to follow the same kind of logic, so that my highlights are on the top of my image and also kind of on the left side. We can kind of perceive that the sun is over here. So all of our shadows are falling to the right. We can see that on all 3 of these camels. That's nice and helpful for us. Now there is the chance that you find your image looking a little bit different than this. You could have a very overcast kind of day in your background image that wouldn't have real perceivable shadows. You could also have something that's kind of backlit, so all the shadows are falling forward, or just inverse of this. Now we can kind of just say our sun is on the left side, and anything that has the sun on the right side we could also use. We just kind of have to invert the image. We just flip it horizontally, and that should work for us. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this into Photoshop, and then I'm going to start looking for extra elements to add to it. So now we're in Photoshop. I've already saved this as a 5-part composite. It's a .psd, so I know I can come back to it and work on it some more. We are 1/5 of the way through this project already. 1 out of the 5 images are here. The other ones will be a little bit more difficult since we have to manipulate them to fit within this image. So back to the internet we'll go, and we'll find ourselves a second image to add to our desert. All right, so here's a guy that we can add to our image. He's taking a selfie. You would notice right away that the shadows and highlights are in the wrong position, right? The highlights are now on the right side, so if there was a sun here, it would be off to the right side and up, and then the shadows are down along the bottom and to the left. So that's the inverse of what we want, but we can clean that up in Photoshop pretty easily. He will go from being right-handed to left-handed, but I think it'll be fine for the purposes of our image. So we're going to pop that into Photoshop and start working on it. All right, I just free transformed that into a slightly bigger image. And to flip it, we have a bunch of options. The easiest one I can tell you is just to go to Free Transform, Control T on your keyboard. If you don't remember, hold in Shift, and then we can flip that guy right around there. He's a little long now, so we'll clean him up. Hey, there we go. Press Enter on your keyboard, and a nice fast way to get rid of that stuff. Now we know how to select an object, so then you can use your choice of selection tools. I'm just going to use the Select Object here and see how well that does. Did a pretty fine job, and I'll probably have to go through and kind of clean things up a little bit. But here is one of the things that I did want to show you guys that is super duper helpful. So right now I could go into my select and mask and kind of really refine this selection. I can also add with my other selection tools and stuff like that. But there's this non-destructive way of creating a mask around your subject So once you make a selection around your object, in the layer panel, there's this little button down here. It looks like a rectangle with a circle in the middle of it, and it says Add Layer Mask. If you hover over it for a second, if you click that, it's going to do a non-destructive mask around your subject. So this still needs cleaned up, but we know how to work with masks since we worked with the adjustment layers and masks last time around. And before that even. So same deal. Now you see that your subject is still there. It's not like you actually erased parts of your subject. So if you need to clean things up, you can. But now you have that layer mask, and if we alt click, we can see what's going on there. So if I need to bring back some of his fingers, which I do, I can just use white, a white brush and a black brush to remove things. I'll just alt click that back so I can see that I'm cleaning up what I want to clean up here. Okay, and I can just use my black brush and clean up that pink on his arm. Okay, this is better. We could certainly go through here and kind of clean things up further. We could have done a much better selection initially as well, but for the purposes of this tutorial, we'll just keep it simple. So I'm going to put him where he needs to be. Maybe he should be down in this bottom corner here. And now even though the sun is kind of on the proper side, so on the left side, and the shadows are in the proper side, we still have some pretty big discrepancies between these two images, and most of that's in color and luminance. So we're just going to go ahead and use our adjustment layers to clean that up. So I'm going to start with a hue and saturation. We should be fairly familiar with this already. And as soon as I start adjusting it, you'll notice that it's adjusting for all layers. Remember, our adjustment layers work for everything underneath it. So if we want to just make it apply to layer number 2, which is our guy, maybe we'll just rename this real quick. We'll call him Selfie Guy. As we add several layers, things can get really confusing quickly, so let's go ahead and keep our stuff organized. So our hue and saturation should only apply to the Selfie Guy, so we're going to click that little button. I know I covered it last week, but not in fine detail, or we didn't use a lot of it, right? So it looks like a little square with an arrow with a strike through it. If we click that, now it's only applied to our Selfie Guy. It only applies to the layer directly underneath it. So let's go ahead and make some adjustments to get him just right. And if we shy out the hue and saturation layer and bring it back, we can kind of see what changes we've made. And it's a subtle one, but hey, it actually makes a pretty significant difference there. So if you're out in the warm desert, you probably look a little bit warmer. So that's essentially what we did here. We kind of pushed things a little bit warmer. Now you probably could have just as easily used like a warming filter if you're into filters, or temperature control, or potentially curves. All of those adjustment layers that you learned about last week, you can kind of make work for this. There's a million ways to do a million things in Photoshop, so whatever you're comfortable with, I suggest you just stick to that. Okay, I'm going to head back to the internet and find my third element. So here's a series of birds. I think that this will go well in my sky. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that, and I will paste it into Photoshop. And I will place it, and then I will rename the layer so I know what I am looking at any given point. So I'll just call that birds. And I could cut out a few of these birds, but first I want to see kind of what they look like in the sky. Now I could just as easily use some kind of selection tool to make this work, but I think that a blending mode will probably do me a little bit better here. So if I drop down on blending modes, I can see what all of these different things do. But if I select darker color here, that takes all of the white stuff, all of the stuff that is brighter than my background, and kind of eliminates it. So I only retain the darker spots of my image. So that's just the birds in the sky there. So that's going to save me a little bit of time with selections and pulling things and feathering and all that fun stuff, and I can just pop the birds in there really quickly and easily. Now this does look like way too many birds, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of some of those, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did before and not actually erase them because I might want to bring them back later, and instead use a layer mask. So I'm going to go ahead and select what I want to keep. So maybe it's this bird, and I'll hold down shift and I'll find a couple of other birds, maybe this one, and maybe these two. So just using my lasso tool really quickly there, I can then use my layer mask button, and I only keep those birds, the ones that I had as a selection. I can move these things around wherever I need to move them, and maybe I want to keep them in that corner. I think that fills out that negative space pretty nicely. But I do think that this side of the sky is a little bit lacking, so maybe I'll add at least another bird over there. So I'm just going to duplicate my layer. I'm going to right click and go to duplicate layer, birds copy, so I can just rename that to birds right. So it'll be the right side of the screen. And then I'll adjust my mask. So I can just right click and go to delete layer mask, and then I'll get all my birds right back. I can move them over to the other side and see which birds I want to keep. I don't want to keep any of them that would repeat these, or all of a sudden it's going to look like the same exact, it's going to look like a duplicate, so I don't want to do that. So I'm going to do a very similar thing, except I'm going to make sure that I don't keep any of the birds that are the same as the others. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'll just keep those three, and I'll do the same thing I did before, create a new layer mask, and I'll move these to the right side. Maybe I'll kind of move the other birds to the right a little bit, and now that kind of fills out my sky. Now if I look really closely at the birds, I can tell that the birds are just a little too dark. They're like a pure black, and even though there's no detail in there, I can actually lift those blacks up a little bit and get them closer to what actually appears in the image otherwise, or naturally. So I'm going to go ahead and add an adjustment layer here. We can just use levels. I think that's a good one for this, and I'm going to have to do it for both sets of birds. So I'm clicking that button again so that my levels only affect my right side birds, but I will add a second one of these. I'll just copy it and paste it for the left side birds. So in my levels, I'm just going to take my midtones and move them over a little bit. You can't really see what's going on, so let me move that real quick. So now my birds are a little bit brighter, and that's basically all I need. I don't need them to be that bright. I just need them to be bright enough so that they're not like a pure black on the background, so they don't jump out at you as being fake. So I can take that same levels if I want to do the same exact adjustment. I can Control C, Control V, and now I've duplicated my levels. I'll move it between my birds right and birds left so that when I click that button again, it's only going to affect the original birds layer. So now I have a levels on my first birds. Let's just rename that really quickly too. So now this is birds left. Okay, so now I have a levels on my birds left and a levels on my birds right, and I know that they're the same exact adjustment. Now I could adjust them further. Maybe my birds left shouldn't be quite as bright since the sky is a little bit darker on that side. We could maybe rationalize that the bird should be a little bit darker too, or maybe the bird should be a little bit brighter. Let's go ahead and take a look and see if anything looks good there. Maybe just a hair darker looks a little bit better. All right, now we have 3 out of 5 images combined. So let's head back to the internet and find another thing. Every desert needs a cactus, and I found a very fake cactus, and we're going to go ahead and pop that in there. It looks okay. It is fake, but it does have a nice white background, so we can pop that out pretty quickly, and I can see it from top to bottom, and it's high resolution, so we'll go ahead and go with that, and hopefully it won't look super fake in our image. So copied, paste, and now we'll free transform this and get it into our image. Again, you can see that the highlights are on the right side instead of the left side, and the shadows are on the left instead of the right, so we'll go ahead and flip that thing around. Remember, hold shift on your keyboard to just affect the horizontal control. And we'll do the same thing that we did with the birds initially, so we're going to go ahead and try that darker color and see how that works. It does all right unless we're on top of the camels, so I think we won't go on top of the camels and make our lives a little bit easier there. Probably needs to be a lot smaller still. And we'll just zoom in to focus strictly on our cactus here, and we'll make some adjustments to make sure that that cactus looks pretty good. First off, we want to take out this pot from the plant, so we'll go ahead and do that with a layer mask. We can do that pretty quickly, I think, and we can just use any selection tool. Again, I'm just going to use that object selection tool. I think it's just a little bit quicker. Okay, and then we are going to create our layer mask. Now, this will do something a little bit different than what we want, but I'll show you how to correct that. So we create our layer mask, but it's grabbed everything that we don't want and removed everything that we do want to keep. So if we press Control and I on our keyboard, we can get an inverted mask. It's just going to reverse what we're seeing through the mask. Now I can then zoom in a little bit and correct that mask. It certainly needs some. I can see a little bit of that pot there. We'll just go ahead and use our brush now. And remember, black erases things and white brings that stuff back, so we can just kind of clean that up a little bit. Okay, and maybe we just want to place this on an area that kind of makes sense. So the edge of this dune kind of works for us. All right, and if I look around at the foliage, I can tell that my cactus is way too green. It doesn't look that kind of yellowy color that this other foliage looks like. So we'll go ahead and correct that with an adjustment layer. I'll go ahead and use the hue and saturation since we've been using a lot of that. But again, there's a motorcycle or a really crappy car. Okay, so I'll go ahead and correct the color on this using hue and saturation, but again, you can use whatever kind of adjustment layer you want. Again, if I start messing with this stuff, it's messing with the whole image, so I got to click that little button so it only affects my layer 2, which, by the way, I'm going to go ahead and rename to cactus. All right, back at the hue and saturation, maybe I can adjust the saturation initially and the hue to get us something that looks proper. All right, color-wise, that doesn't look too bad, but there's still something a little bit off about it. So if I zoom in and I look at any other area of my image that's approximately on the same plane, so we look at this little bit of grass here, or whatever you call it, grass or foliage, compared to this looks super sharp in comparison, right? Like this looks much more blurry, out of focus, because what we have in focus is our cactuses and then also our selfie guy. So what we want to do is kind of blur this a little bit in terms of like its depth of field, right? So it's further away from the area of focus with the lens. And we can do that pretty easily. We can do that just through a filter. So if we go up to filter here, we can go to blur, And then we can add a series of blurs. Now you can use a Gaussian blur. It's very, very fast to blur a single layer. By the way, we just want to be on the cactus layer before we do this. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur is fast. Lens blur is more accurate if you're doing something for depth of field, right? So as soon as I click that, it'll give you some options. And if you know a lot about your camera, like if you took the background image that you're trying to match to, you can match the lens pretty exactly if you know a lot about your lens. But we can just go by the presets here. That's just fine. And then we'll just adjust the blur that appears on our layer. So the blur is just this radius here. If we turn down the radius, we'll see that our blur is not so prominent. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit so I can see better. All right, so that's getting closer with a radius of 1 to what we had. So a lot of stuff is in focus in our image. It's not too out of focus, but that little bit of blur should be able to help us out a little bit. Maybe I'll go back into the hue and saturation for just a second and push things a little bit more yellow. Turn up the brightness a hair. All right, much better. So there we've added a cactus to our image, looking good. So that is 1 with the selfie guy, 2 with the background, 3 with the birds, and 4 with the cactus. We only need 1 more, and we'll call it a day. So I couldn't think of anything that would naturally go into a desert scene like we have, so I thought I'd do something kind of silly and see if people would notice right off the bat. I'm going to grab a happy birthday hat and put it on one of the camels, and maybe it'll kind of sink in there. So birthday hat. White background could make this easy using the darker color, but let's go ahead and just use a selection tool again. So we'll just use the object selector. Make sure that we get the entirety of the object. See how it does pretty well. That's a good start. We'll go ahead and turn that into our layer mask, and then we'll go through and kind of clean some things up really quickly. All right, much better. I'm just gonna free transform this, turn it smaller, make sure it fits on my on one of my camels. Well, let's go ahead and put it on this back camel here. Okay, that's a good position for it. We'll go ahead and do that same thing we had before with the lens blur. And we'll just repeat our lens blur settings. So I could go into blur and then lens blur, but if I click on filter, I see that there's a lens blur setting at the very top there. If I click that, it's just going to repeat the same thing that we did with the cactus. So I'll go ahead and just stick with that. To go a little bit quicker, so with a party hat here, hue and saturation might not work quite as well, right? So you have that blue, red, green, these very clear, vibrant colors. As we start to adjust the hue itself, it's not going to make our image look warmer. Instead, it's going to shift. Maybe the blue will look warmer, but then the yellow will look cooler. So we don't want to do that exactly. Maybe now this makes sense just to use the photo filter since we're going a little bit faster with things. So as I turn up the old photo filter, you'll see that my hat's now getting warmer overall, but everything else is too. I'll go ahead and click that button. Now it's just the hat. Hey, that's helping me out quite a bit. You could have taken the same approach with all of the other layers if that makes sense for your particular image that you've chosen. Now my hat is a little bit too dark, so I'm going to go ahead and add a levels to it. I'll make sure that it's only affecting the party hat again, and then I can just turn that up a little bit so that it's a little bit brighter. All right, there we go. And if I zoom out, hey, it looks like it's in place. It's how it's supposed to be. Now, if I look at my image, yeah, the selfie guy looks a little bit weird. Why would he be out here? And he's not dirty and stuff. All of that stuff is a clear indicator that he's not where he's supposed to be. The other things look a little bit better, but I'm just going to leave the selfie guy because that's nice and easy for me. There is one thing that could come up pretty consistently with these projects. It doesn't look so bad with mine because I found this area that has a bit of a place for my cactus, but you might need to create some shadows for your objects that you put into your image. So let's go ahead and give that a shot real quick and see what we can do with it. Alright, so let's say that I want to create a shadow for this cactus. Well, the first thing I would have to do is create a duplicate of the cactus. So there's a couple ways to do that. Right click and go to duplicate layer, or we can just press Control C, Control V. It is going to give us some trouble initially because it messed with that hue and saturation, which is now not linked to the original cactus layer. So let's find out which one is our new cactus. That's the one, and it just kind of popped up in the wrong place for us. So I'm going to go ahead and put that up top so I can keep track of it pretty easily. I'm going to fix that hue and saturation so it's relinked to my cactus, and now we don't have nearly the problems that we did before. So back at that new duplicate cactus layer, we'll go ahead and rename that really quickly to Cactus Shadow so we don't get confused. And then we have an issue here right away, and that is there is a layer mask on it, but what's really getting rid of all that white background is the blending mode. So and because we're going to want to use a blending mode on the shadow on the background so it can kind of, you know, blend together, we can't use two for the same layer. So we're just going to put that back at normal. So we can use any of the selection tools to select out our cactus and then create a new layer mask, or we can just use our brushes. Since it's been a pretty easy process, we'll go ahead and do that really quickly. Now with a shadow, it doesn't have to be super well defined, so oops, make sure that you're on your layer mask here when you're doing it. But if you're at all worried about like the quills, I guess it's called, or spikes of like a cactus or fine details, you don't have to really worry about that too much with a shadow, since shadows are pretty blurry generally. What you want is just the shape to be there. Now the same process would have worked just fine with our other cactus. To select it out, we just use the blending mode because it's a little bit quicker. Now if you find that that blending mode, that darker color or maybe lighter color, depending on what your subject matter is, doesn't work for you, then you might just do something like this. Alright, we have a cutout of our cactus shape. Rough shape right now, but that's no worry to us, since we'll go ahead and blur that and do some interesting things with it to make it look like a shadow. So initially I want to turn my cactus just a pure black, which is pretty easy for us to do. If I go into levels and then I toggle that on just for the cactus shadow again, and I push things way to the right, we'll get our cactus to turn a pure black. Alright, we are at a pure black cactus now, and we are getting close. Now I'm just going to zoom out really quickly and take a look at our other shadows here. Now with yours, you might be able to find a blending mode that works for you. These shadows are pretty dark though, so I could maybe pick one of like darken or multiply, but I don't really see much of a difference happening there. You might with your image. Instead, I'm just going to use the opacity control and start to toggle that down until it looks like the other shadows that we have in our image. Okay, that's an approximation currently, and then we can kind of adjust from here after we get everything else placed. So, alright, I can see through my shadow just a little bit, but it's kind of awkward looking right now. We need it to be kind of skewed and adjusted to kind of match what's happening with these camels here. So I'm going to go ahead and start by using the free transform. So Control T, rotate. And remember, holding shift to ungang horizontal from vertical shifts in your transform. So I press enter, and then I have something that's a little bit closer to these camels, but maybe it actually, I guess it should be almost a straight horizontal adjustment. I'm going to put that directly on top of the base of the original cactus. Then I'm just going to go ahead and erase a little bit of the bottom of the cactus there, so it's not covering up my original cactus layer. I'm just going to do this by messing with our layer mask. We'll go ahead and use a brush for this. Now if I look closer at the camel shadows, I can see that they kind of bend with the surrounding area. So if we're going down a hill, it's got a bit of a bend to it. So here's something that we haven't really covered in class yet. So if we go up to edit, we can find both of these things that we haven't used yet, puppet warp and perspective warp. And depending on what your content is, you might be able to use one better than the other. But so for this, I'm just going to go ahead and use the puppet warp. What happens as soon as you click that on is you'll get this fine mesh across whatever layer you've selected it on for, and then you can add puppet pinpoints. This will actually carry over pretty well into After Effects. That very similar process there. So as I put these pinpoints in, each of these points will stay static as I move another one. And it's probably easier just for me to show you how this would work. So I put 2 at the edge and 1 in the middle. If I click and hold that middle one, you can see how it kind of deforms the shape that we have. So I can do that throughout the shadow here so that it follows the hills in the background. As soon as I'm happy with that, I can press enter and take a look at what we have. It is looking a little bit better. Now I probably want to go back and adjust that opacity down a little bit more. Okay. And there's probably one more thing that I want to do with it. It's kind of a super sharp shadow right now, and that's not to say that the camels don't have fairly sharp shadows, but not quite as sharp as what we have here. I'll just go up to filter, I'll go to blur, and this time rather than a lens blur, I'll go ahead and use a Gaussian blur, which is just a little bit faster. Okay, so with that blurred edge, it looks pretty darn unnatural, so I'm just going to go into my opacity and start bringing that down until it looks like something that could exist in this space. So down, 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 and all of a sudden that looks a little bit better. Let's see if it looks better just without it at all. It looks okay with it on there. It just needs to be very subtle. All right, so that is 5 elements, right? We have the birds, we have the selfie guy, we have the desert, we have the cactus, and we have the party hat there. So the idea is you're going to do something very similar. You're going to post the results on Canvas as always, but this time don't tell us exactly what you did. Don't tell us which elements are composited into this image, and let us take a guess. And if we can't find all 5 of them, you've done a pretty good job. Whichever ones we do see, maybe those are the areas that could be refined a little bit further. So this should have been a fairly simple project for you. Hopefully you're just taking the same elements that you knew from the prior tutorial and doing them in a much more refined way, trying to match rather than just follow your creative instincts. So this would get us one step away from After Effects. We are still going to do the fonts tutorial, which is, 50-50 Photoshop, and then into After Effects, and I'll also give you, starting next week, the guidelines for your midterm design projects.